It's setting up, at least from my end. And it looks like you're
live now on YouTube.
We're live, right? Okay.
Yes.
And it's 11 o'clock. So with our strict Argentinian punctuality, if you're not laughing, it's because you haven't worked in Argentina. We're going to get started at 11 sharp. And it's my great pleasure to again welcome you all for another weekly meeting of the Frontiers in Social Evolution seminar. We've had some fantastic presentations last semester, and so have we this spring one. And today promises to be nothing less than what we've had before. Today we have with us presenting Dr. John W. Fitzpatrick, who's going to be the presenter, but he's doing this presentation in collaboration with Reed Bowman. And John is the Luis Agassi Fuertes Executive Director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. He's also a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell. But what I want to do to make this introduction special is, before saying one more word about John, let me just read this from him. I mean, straight from him. In kindergarten, while sick at home during a spring day, I saw a male American redstart out the living room window and identified it using my parents' Peterson field guide. I was instantly mesmerized by all the other beautiful species illustrated in those pages. And this began my lifelong quest to see them all. I don't know if he's seen them all, but I do know that he's seen the jays quite for some time, getting to 50 years. So over these 50 years, he has done an impressive number of things. And as it is usually the case with the fantastic speakers we get, I mean, there's no shortage of publications. There's no shortage of grants that have allowed him to support the research all these years. What I think he brings different from most of the speakers we've heard is that his profound long-term commitment to outreach and to what the Cornell Lab has really become a flag for advancing, which is citizen science. I mean, they describe in the hundreds of thousands of people without maybe formal training in the sciences who have been attracted the same way probably that he was attracted when he was sick in bed as a kid to birds or to other animals and to all kinds of wildlife. He described himself as primarily interested in the conservation of endangered species and the management of environments to protect those species. So again, he brings it, I think it's going to be a very rich and different perspective to some of our other speakers, because he has taken over the years a much more applied perspective to how our studies of any single species can contribute to the conservation of species, populations, and habitats. He'll be talking about research that he's done primarily with the jays, with the scrap jays in Florida. What I understand, he saw them for the first time during his college years when he did an internship. And some time after that, he became the director of the Archbold field station in Florida, where he stayed for something about 10 years or so. Then moving to Cornell, where he's now been the executive director of the Cornell Lab for 25 years. So it gives me a lot of joy to introduce, he goes by Fitz, and because we're a very friendly audience, I'm sure he'll be fine if we refer to him like that. So he will be presenting to us today on the work that he's done with the Florida scrap jays, Supersize, fire cycles, competition for space, and cooperative breeding in the Florida scrap jay. As usual, he'll present for about 50 minutes, and then we're going to go to a question and answer session that I want to let you know today we will finish 12:45. He has, I suspect, another important meeting trying to get the funding we all need to maintain all these wonderful resources. The other announcement we want to make, the two of us in collaboration from our planning yesterday, is that he may get disconnected. And this is to our younger colleagues. You plan. So we did plan, and it's happened to him before that something goes wrong with his credentials for internet at the field station. He'll be presenting to us from the field station in Florida. So if that happens, we just need to relax, give him a few minutes until his because it's happened to him before. He'll figure it out and he'll rejoin us. So with all that, it's my pleasure to introduce Fitz. Please, Fitz, take it from here. I think I've already made you. Have I made you? Yes, I have. So
okay, good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Very nice introduction. I'm happy to see your son Facundo, our wonderful Cornell student, also in the audience. Hello, Facundo. And hello to all of you from all of the different parts of the world that you're tuning in from. I am going to share screen right now. And if it all goes well, we'll be ready to start this thing. That look good?
Looks good. You're ready to go. Yep.
So a great pleasure to be participating in this series of seminars. I'm going to cover try to cover a fair amount of ground today. I will keep my eye on the clock and see if I can get through. I'm overjoyed to be able to share some of the thoughts through the years we've had about evolution of cooperative breeding in this and its related species, but I'm also happy to just share some features of this really remarkable bird and system that we've been studying for the last 25 years. As you see, I share this authorship with my very close colleague, Reed Bowman. And now I'm trying to figure out why I can't advance here. So hang on. Technical issues. I'm not advancing. Oh, there we go. That's Reed before his beard turned entirely white, who is the head of the Avian Ecology Lab here at Archbold Biological Station. And I want to, as I always do in broad public seminars, dedicate the talk and acknowledge the fact that this man, Glenn Wolfenden, began banding these Florida scrub jays in 1969 because they looked intriguing during some work he was doing in unrelated areas. We lost Glenn in 2007, but the study is a multi-generational one in terms of the investigators. And so I've followed on as a head of this study for a while. And it's graduated now to Reed, who himself is thinking about it graduating to somebody else. So hats off to Glenn, who really started this work more than 50 years ago. I always want to make sure that people understand that we're looking at a system that is really an unusual one in North America, and in a way, it's quite unusual worldwide. The Florida Peninsula itself, a subtropical peninsula on a temperate zone continent, has existed for 20+ million years. And what we're looking at is a bird that is entirely restricted to Florida. Now, this is a really unusual picture. This is a picture taken of Florida from space 2 million years ago. That's what the Florida Peninsula looked like in the highest of all the Pleistocene and Pliocene-Pleistocene sea level rises. It was almost literally inundated by the sea, but not quite. The central spine of Florida was above water for a period of time on which all of the flora and fauna that had been there persisted. And we can see today, if you can see my cursor, you see today the very spit of land that I'm running up and down that was the entire Florida Peninsula during that highest of all the sea level rises. That peninsula is a 500-foot thick pile of sand. It's an old sand dune, and in Florida today, there are remnant ridges of sand dunes running up and down, especially the East Coast. And on those sand dunes occurs the habitat that the Florida scrub jay is restricted to. The little red circle there identifies the spot near the southern tip of that old Florida peninsula where Archbold Biological Station exists. There you see it labeled there. You can see vaguely, those of you who aren't colorblind, that is, the orange outline of this so-called Lake Wales Ridge, the old ancient shoreline of old Florida. And you can also see how much white appears in here. That's all the white sand underlying this unique habitat that exists only on the peninsula of Florida in old sand dune deposits that were left by various sea level rises. So we're looking at an ancient relict habitat that contains a wide variety of oddball species, including the only species of bird entirely limited to the state of Florida. Today, this bird was listed on the endangered species list of the US back in 1987. Today, there are fewer than 4,000, and it's dropping even as we speak. This is a deeply endangered species at this point. I want to just emphasize one more time that we're looking at a pretty odd spot. The soil base for this habitat is literally pure white sand. The locals call it sugar sand because it bears such a resemblance. And in this habitat occur a whole host of endemic species and genera, such as this legless skink, this mouse whose closest relatives exist as relict populations in southwestern Central America. This is the Florida mouse, unique to the Florida scrubs. And indeed, this Florida scrub jay, limited to this central part of the peninsula. You see a slightly more accurate description of its range over here on the right. Importantly here for this talk, the scrub jay, and fortunately from a scientific standpoint, this scrub jay is a member of a complex of species of jays that are distributed across Western North America and now recognized as a series of separate species. The biggest and weirdest one, I think I have pictures, here we go. The almost crow-sized one that's isolated on the island of Santa Cruz off California. The widespread, very common backyard bird in California, the California scrub jay. The much scarcer and more ecologically restricted interior populations of woodhouses jay, and then this very isolated population in Florida. The interesting thing about this complex, by the way, there's one other species to mention because I'll come back to it near the end of the talk, and that is the closely related member of the same genus, the Mexican jay, restricted almost entirely to Mexico, just gets up into Arizona and New Mexico, extreme southern end. And we'll come back to the fact that that bird has a really interesting social organization that is similar to, but somewhat more, if you want to think of it as advanced, than the scrub jays. Back as early as the mid-1980s, we and others published a few papers that sort of outlined the basic structure of social organization within this very interesting group. Varies from those that are typical early dispersers and first-year breeders, that is the interior and coastal populations. The species on Santa Cruz Island, which is of course limited to a 25-mile long island that has delayed breeding but not cooperative. Then there's our bird, the one focused on today, this Florida scrub jay, Cirrolescens, which has delayed dispersal and has cooperative breeding. And then we go all the way to this very much more complex, larger group size, plural nesting species we'll again return to at the very end of the talk. One question, sort of a formulating question for this talk and for some of our work has been, why does this one population of this widespread genus show this singular nesting cooperative breeding behavior, whereas its Western broadly distributed counterparts not show it, and its relative in Mexico actually show an even more complex one? So what is giving rise to these different kinds of social behavior? Quickly, there is the entire comprehensive distribution of the Florida scrub jay that we documented in the early 1990s using a lot of citizen help as well as local biologists. We are focused most of our work in this central Florida zone. In fact, we have 3 separate studies underway, 2 of which are continuing to the present, one of which has gone extinct literally because it was based in a suburban habitat that has basically used up the habitat. We watched the demography of extinction go on in that study. But I'll be focusing this talk today on information gathered down here at the southern end of the Lake Wales Ridge at Archbold. Here's a look at the main building of Archbold Biological Station. We're looking westward out over the broad, multiple square mile tract owned by the station and managed very well by the station. This is a permanent ecological institute and dedicated to understanding the ecology of the entire system, from the tiny to the macro. Our subject bird is widely distributed across this habitat out there west of the main building, especially in that low open habitat that you see out there. That's the Florida oak scrub, unique again to Central Florida. We've been banding these jays as nestlings since 1969, and very quickly, our population study continues to this day. And I'm not going to read all of these features of our methods, but I want to stress that we've maintained some very important habits from the beginning. Every single month since April 1971, we've done a complete census of our banded population. So we have very detailed information about survival, movement patterns, and so on. We now take blood from every jay, whether it's a nestling or an immigrant, for DNA archives. We map the territories every year. We have an acorn count annually. We now have a 15 generation pedigree. And very recently, I'll make a very quick reference to this, we've begun to use brand new technology for doing very micro scale analysis of jay movements and dispersal. The study, as you might imagine, for 50 years has encompassed a whole bunch of themes. And one of the features of a long-term study, multi-decadal study like this, is that we evolve the studies, the questions we can ask evolve as time goes on, as more data build up, and as technology changes, so that we're on a continuing roll of new questions and new opportunities for understanding this bird in relation to its habitat and its ecosystem in genuinely ecological scales. And you'll see why that's important in a second. Today, I'll be covering briefly just this aspect of these themes, just emphasizing here that there are a lot of other themes in our long-term study, a lot of which, as Eduardo pointed out, have a lot to do with conservation. One more acknowledgement. We could not possibly be doing work of this intensity every spring without the help of a great annual cycle of interns and graduate students that come through here. So right now, mid-March, the jays are beginning to nest, and we have assembled a new cohort of 6 interns. These are largely post-baccalaureate students who are on their way in a gap year towards graduate work. A quick little advertisement for you or for your students to watch for the possibility of joining this team next spring or some subsequent spring. The social milieu of this species is pretty standard for a singular breeding territorial bird that is non-migratory. They defend vigorously and year-round territories that vary from 10 hectares to up to 15 or even larger sizes. That's a pretty big territory for a bird with this body size. I'm going to get back to the large territory size in just a minute. Just for orientation, that orange rectangle is the building you saw in the previous picture. And you can see the mosaic of an example of a map of territories that we do every single spring. We remap these territories as they do change a bit year to year. Birds pop out of the nest in the spring, April and May, and they look like pine cones. They're very dependent on their family. And essentially all jays delay dispersal for at least 1 year. And for the most part, they remain at home with their parents. The picture you see here was the cover of our book, actually, back in the mid-1980s. This is an older female over the nest. These are that female's parents. And these are the kids that female is helping raise the following year. So this simple cooperative system, single pair and young of previous 1, 2, or 3 years staying with the parents and helping. Just quickly, you can see that the modal age for first breeding is 2. Almost nobody breeds at age 1. Modal ages for first breeding are ages 2 and 3 for both sexes. Females, the dispersing sex, tend to leave earlier. Males can sometimes hang around 4, 5, even 6 years as helpers. Importantly, this contributes to to quickly answering the question, why are they permanently monogamous? We analyzed some years ago in conjunction with a couple of other studies, features of reproductive success for pairs that stayed together as the same pair between years. And the longer a pair stays together, the higher its annual reproductive success. Particularly is true for jays that have helpers. This graph also serves to underscore the fact that helpers really do help. In this system, the presence of extra birds beyond the breeding pair does actually increase somewhat the reproductive success of the group. In fact, so quickly, there's a typical look at a Florida scrub jay family. About half our pairs, by the way, fail to produce young in a given year and therefore live as solitary pairs. The other half live in various size groups from 3 to about 6 individuals each year. Key to understanding cooperative breeding and the demography of social organizations like this. This is a slightly complicated slide, and it shows a couple of different things importantly. Focus on the solid line first. That's the annual number of yearlings, that is potential breeders, produced per breeding pair across our populations through years. One thing to acknowledge, populations vary like crazy year after year. Population is no exception. Some years are awful for reproduction. Some years are awful for survival. But in general, there is about, let's say, 0.6 yearlings per breeding pair. Hugely important is the fact that in that same population area over the same time span, fewer than 0.4 breeding vacancies appear as a result of death of breeders. So what we've got building up here is a queue of birds that are waiting and trying to become, to fill in, to become part of the breeding population. But there are more potential breeders produced than there are spaces for those individuals to recruit. That leaves the question then, what do I do as an offspring? Well, one classical answer, of course, is stay home and help mom and dad, because as long as your two parents are alive, you're related to those sibs by a factor of 1/2. And so we've now asked the question with enough data to be able to understand exactly what the scale of indirect fitness gains is for this species. And as you can see, compared to simple pairs with no helpers, there is clearly an effect of additional number of helpers, up to 4, in producing a larger brood sizes. The key point in this graph, number 1, yes, they're related to the sibs, and therefore they are gaining a slight indirect reproductive success by helping raise kin. But that level of indirect effect is very small. It's about 0.1 to 0.15 offspring per year. Very small compared to how one would do if one could establish himself as a breeder. So quickly summarizing what we know so far, there are indirect gains by helping. They are, in this species and in many other of the simple cooperative breeding species that have been studied, relatively marginal. They certainly move in the direction of selecting for staying home and helping, but they're not by themselves very large. And in most cases, we suspect, don't themselves explain why the individuals should stay home. Instead, we focus on the large number and a growing number, frankly, that we're aware of direct fitness gains in a saturated breeding environment, living at home with the parents whose interests coincide with yours as an offspring, gives you the safest place to cue developing a sentinel system, looking out for predators mutually and so on. And it allows these birds to monitor the environment, monitor the neighborhood, and ultimately disperse into the breeding population without having to go long distances across the neighboring landscapes filled with all of the costs of dispersal. When we look at the fitness of jays once they become breeders, it's important to note that 1 in 5 never even leave a breeding offspring. So it's very difficult to attain really high reproductive, lifetime reproductive fitness in this population. Only a very few individuals leave comparatively large numbers of young. This underscores, of course, the importance of longevity. And as with many other long-lived iteroparous organisms, a lot of lifetime reproductive success depends on staying alive. So staying alive is a huge premium in this species. And what that means that what we want to do is pay a lot of attention to factors that affect survival. And one of the questions most interesting relating to dispersal strategy is how do the different strategies of dispersal affect fitness? Given that lifetime fitness varies so closely with breeding lifespan. I don't have time to go into the entire analyses of this, but ultimately what we want to do is understand different features of the dispersal decisions facing these organisms. As fledglings, a very few of them can actually try breeding their first year. Almost none do in this population, at least. Many become first-year helpers and then become novice breeders. Others stick around for a couple of years and then become novice breeders. The question is when, how far, and how do they disperse? The most important result from our analyses of dispersal over the last 2 decades is shown in this slide, in which we compare the number of independent young in a lifetime produced by individuals who bred within 2 territories of home compared to those who bred farther than 2 territories from home. In both sexes, there is a 20% penalty for breeding more than 2 territories from home. We think this has a lot to do with familiarity of the neighborhood, with familiarity of acorn sources and other features required for survival, as well as cover and so on. What we do know from analyses of these individual cohorts is that this cost to long distance dispersal is paid in the lower survival of the long distance dispersals once they become breeders. As a consequence, of course, if there was apparent selection for short distance dispersal, we can see, as shown in this graph, very recently published, that males in particular are the highly prone to breeding within 1 or 2 territories of their home. Even females, which are the more dispersing sex in this species as well as most birds, slightly farther distances on average, but even for females, the modal distance from home is just 1 to 2 territories away. So this is a very, very viscous dispersal system entirely. That correlates with some behavior that we've tallied through the years. As we map territories every year, we take note of small groups of non-breeding birds who are located together in small little groups, sort of loose aggregations. We might even call them little flocks, but they're not really that tightly aggregated. When we tallied up the distance from home, as we did these censuses of these little wandering yearling and 2-year-old groups, what we noted is, indeed, as one would predict from the survival information, there's a clear tendency for non-breeding jays to be monitoring the neighborhood, and it drops way off just 2 territories away from home. This is a really interesting phase of life. It's actually the focus of the dissertation of one of my current and I will say my last cohort of graduate students. Young So, who is working on this question about what's the behavior of non-breeding jays as it relates to their potential ultimate dispersal decisions. I'll just quickly shout out that Young is applying a new technology just recently come available, namely RF tags, radio frequency tags that are small enough for like a 1 to 1.5 grams for a scrub jay to wear them on as a backpack. And we've outfitted the entire study area with a grid of nodes that are receiving. There's a node. These are receiving every 2 seconds calls from little bips from these tags. And through triangulation, we can actually calculate in a very, very fine grain. This is a several day record of 2 non-breeding individuals in comparison to their natal territory where they existed during that 2-day period. You can see those 2 individuals spending lots of time at home, but also, as I mentioned earlier, doing a pretty fair amount of discovery out there within the adjacent neighborhood. But again, as suggested by our preliminary early data, only usually within 1 or 2 territories away from home. I look forward to seeing Young's work on this. We now have 2 years of information of this kind, and watch for her work. This is going to be really revolutionary for understanding the fine-grained features of pre-breeding prospecting and early dispersal behavior. One question that we've asked in the past is about this aspect of becoming a breeder that is unique to males in our system, that is territorial budding. This is a system in which a male basically inherits the back 40 acres of mom and dad's farm, pairs with an incoming female, and establishes a new territory. We call that a dispersal distance of half a territory. And we've long asked the question out here, for decades, literally, we've asked the question, why don't more male helpers take advantage of this opportunity to inherit a piece of the territory they've helped defend and create a new territory of themselves? Here's a sample. It's the same territory map I showed earlier. And for that particular year, that's 2006, you can see the 4 territories that were created that year through territorial budding. They're marked in blue. You can see that they're small. They always start small. But across this habitat, across that year, you see marked in blue a bunch of other older male helpers who could have budded but didn't. So we've long asked this question, why is this not more common in the Florida scrub jay system? Very briefly, the answer appears to be that it is a really risky strategy, because the survivorship of birds that take part in a territorial bud is actually just as bad as the survivorship of incoming immigrants, which is the lowest that we have altogether. So this first 2-year period after a bud, let's face it, typically budding males are novices. Typically they're pairing with a dispersing female who's also a novice. So we have 2 novice breeders with no helpers. They're establishing a new boundary, and their territory is small. As a consequence of the stresses that produces, we observe a 50% loss in the cohorts of jays that engaged in territorial budding over just that first 2 years. So clearly there's a pretty big cost or risk associated with it. On the other hand, those jays that accomplished territorial buds and stayed alive after the 2 years show the highest annual survivorship of any of the cohorts that we look at. So we kind of look at this budding question as a quality test. Some of the individuals take the gamble and lose, but the highest quality individuals actually have the advantage of inheriting a piece of land that requires no movement from home, and ultimately enjoying very high survivorship thereafter. So there's clearly some favorable selection for budding, but it's not for the faint of heart. And there's one of our conclusions about budding. It's a risky, as noted in this somewhat expanded version of a previous slide that you saw, risky and high stakes, but it does supply the opportunity to breed without ever having to incur the dangers of leaving home at all. Meanwhile, the rest of the jays are monitoring the neighborhood for vacancies. They are, importantly, establishing and monitoring their own dominance relationships, which we think ultimately prove to be very important in terms of when they decide to leave home. There are opportunities, especially among males, to directly inherit the parental territory, but this is relatively rare. Now, for the rest of the talk, I want to point to sort of the second half of this talk is addressing another question that we've asked for a generation, and only relatively recently, we think, come to an answer about. Namely, why does this bird, which is the smallest of all of the scrub jays, defend by far the largest territories, even larger than the great big giant island scrub jay? And even some of these territories can be as much as 20 and 25 hectares. This bird clearly defends a territory much larger than its body size would suggest. Indeed, this was actually noticed by this, I think his name is Scott Shank, who in the mid-1980s published this analysis of the primary productivity per territory among singular nesters and plural nesting corvids. And Shank noticed that the one big outlier was this bird, the Florida scrub jay. And if we actually go in and look at what the primary productivity is of Florida scrub jay territories as we now know them, it's actually even larger than what Shank used as his variable in this graph. So this bird has an unusually large territory size for its body size, even among cooperatively breeding jays. What's going on with this big territory? We think the answer has a lot to do with the evolution and maintenance of the cooperative system altogether. So this is like a preview of my conclusion. Clearly, it's not about resources, right? This is what a Western scrub jay territory looks like, a typical one. It's pretty tough out there in the West compared to the lush scrub habitats of Central Florida that receive 55 inches of rain per year and have resources all year round. We don't think the answer has to do with a resource depletion with respect to the Florida system. Instead, so there's again a general, just to set the scene here, there's our 2006 scrub jay map, and there are typical territory sizes of Western scrub jays, which, remember, are actually a bit larger than the Florida scrub jay. So what's going on with these huge territories year round? A couple of different features. I'm hearing a voice there. Can I just check? Are things coming across okay?
It's good. I unmuted somebody's microphone. It's
okay, good deal. Thanks, Karsten. One of the features that plays a big part in this story is the fact that this Florida scrub jay depends very much on an essential crop, namely acorns. We know from a long-term study of acorn production by 3 of the oak species that are dominant in the scrub, that although they are clearly variable, there's never a year that lacks acorns. So there's always a relatively constant acorn supply. Acorns, by the way, are extremely important in this species' life cycle, because from September to February, they are doing a lot of eating of acorns. This is a period during the dry middle of winter in Florida, is a period in which we know that the insect resource goes way down. So they syncopate their diet between insects in the summer and acorns in the winter. They absolutely require acorns for survival through the winter. Incidentally, each individual buries about 8,000 of them in their territory, and they dig up between 4,000 and 5,000 of those over the course of the winter. So a hugely important supply. And now overlay this feature of the Central Florida Peninsula system. Namely, in the summertime, the convective thunderstorm season settles in a big way, and the lightning associated with these storms produces the highest lightning strike frequency in all of North America, the third or fourth highest lightning strike frequency of any spot in the world. And where you get that much lightning in a system filled with organic matter like Florida, you get ignition, you get fires, and fires are part of the natural cycle and system of the Florida Peninsula and have been for 30 million years. The consequence of a fire burning through the scrub is very significant. There's a day after one of the fires coming through one of our study area. This was actually an experimental burn that you'll see that date, June 2010. You'll see that again in a second. But there's what it looks like after a fire. And studies here at Archbold on the plant ecology of the oaks show us that it takes oaks 2 to 3 years to grow back the branches on which to grow acorns. So these oaks go through a little shadow of acorn-free time after a fire. Think about what that means to you as a Florida scrub jay on your territory. Fire comes through, the area that got burned is not going to produce acorns for the next 2 to 3 years. So these episodic wildfires are resetting the oaks, which take 2 to 3 years to bear acorns. I'm showing you here one of the wildfires that happened in 1989, and it happened right after we'd mapped our scrub jay territories there. Here that same zone is in 1992. You can see a slight reduction in density of territories there as a consequence of the very, very thorough burn. During that year, a third of the breeding birds that lived on those heavily burned territories perished. They didn't perish in the fire. They perished during the season in which they're trying hard to harvest acorns. And the mortality went way up. So here's sort of a paradox beginning to develop, right? We've got fire that presents a real survivor cost if the territory is mostly or entirely burned. Starting to move you now towards understanding why it might pay to have a larger territory. There's another side to this story. We were monitoring this population of jays south of the main building for the course of the 70s and 80s. And by 1990, we realized this territory, this zone was the jays were almost gone. We hypothesized the role of fire. We burned that area in 1990. And over the course of the next 20 years, we documented the fire cycle in the population, showing that there is an optimal window of about 8 years or so after a fire that allows populations to recover enormously, but then in the absence of additional burns, trail off again and begin to mimic what they had done in the previous cycle. So what did we do? Of course, we said, well, by 2010, remember that number, that date, we burned it again. And we are now continuing to monitor the response, and the same response again is underway. So we clearly have experimentally demonstrated a very important role of fire in maintaining a habitat that is conducive to Florida scrub jay demographic success. What's the reason for that? Very quickly, by the way, there's a lot of other plants and organisms that have the same cycle. But very quickly, very importantly, the first year survival of juveniles leaving the nest in the times immediately after fire is 50%. The willingness of breeders to replace a lost breeder in an early post-fire successional habitat is very high. And the carving out of brand new territories in early post-fire succession is also very high. Clearly, these jays know this is the place you want to live. And we think that clearly the reason for this is it's such high survivorship of the young. If we look at juvenile survivorship in a variety of demographic contexts, scrub in which the scrub has not burned for 10 to 15 years, Juvenile survivorship is results in a lambda well below 1. It gets worse if the scrub is even more than 15 years post-fire, almost nil survivorship. In suburban areas, I referred to that population that has gone extinct. The survivorship of young is very low. We think that's due to house cats. But in periodically burned scrub, the survivorship of young is sufficient to supply recruitment numbers. And in particular, this early post-fire successional stage is magnificent for keeping your young alive to age 1. As a consequence of that, what we've demonstrated recently is that territories that have not been burned in the preceding, that have no portion of their habitat burned in the previous 9 years, show a much lower production of offspring, including production of offspring that ultimately become breeders, compared to territories that have relatively high proportions of their territory that have burned in the last 9 years. So burning reduces your acorns, but burning increases your offspring survivorship. This generates the sort of conditions that lead to large territories producing advantages. We've published recently one other study that shows that larger territories actually supply resources such that nestlings grow faster in the larger territories. Male offspring from larger territories become breeders earlier than females. This is an inverse graph. This is age at first nesting. So this is so the earlier breeders are jays that came from the largest territories. And the lifetime probability of breeding is higher from jays from the largest territories. So altogether, what we're seeing, and I'm coming to a conclusion here, we're seeing that this oversized territory, we regard it as representing functionally, from an adaptive sense, a triple insurance policy, advantageous specifically in a fire-prone ecosystem. Fires have both costs and benefits, resources relatively thinly distributed through space and time. The three advantages are, as we've outlined now, the probability of actually retaining some unburned habitat ensures that you have an acorn supply even after a fire comes through, because fires are typically patchy. A large enough territory supplies some probability that you're going to have some burned habitat in your territory, which supplies you the opportunity to have elevated offspring recruitment. And finally, the fate of those offsprings is improved by the larger territories, in the largest territories. The consequence of these three findings about this system suggest one simple rule for territorial behavior in the Florida scrub jay: defend as much space as you possibly can, period. Which sounds great, except of course everybody else is doing that too. So this pressure to defend as much space as one possibly can, incidentally, anecdotally, we have lots of stories about jays that have the opportunity to defend 100 acres, and they do, such that we can't even introduce another pair there because that pair is so active in defense of a grotesquely oversized territory. This pressure supplies this dense population, this honeycomb of territories, in which every territory is madly trying to gain space at the expense of every other territory. Juveniles not being tolerated next door, except casually, have as their best option, stay home, help the parents actually defend more territory. Indeed, a principal finding of our book way back decades ago was that as family size grows, the territory size grows. So by staying home as young, the opportunity exists to expand the size of the territory, which in itself has all of these ancillary benefits we've just discussed. So stay home kids actually supply the parents some help with paying this insurance bill. And what we know is that the question about fire is not if, It's only when. This is actually a map of one of the fires that came through our study in 2001. It was a natural wildfire. All of these territories are going to burn at some point. The fuel load is sufficient after just 3 or 4 years to carry a fire should the ignition exist. So what we have here with the Florida scrub jay system is an example of a stably reoccurring but unpredictably timed disturbance. What's the best thing to do for such a situation? Humans know the answer to that very well. We develop insurance companies specifically for such purposes. Indeed, that's what's happening in nature, we think, in lots of different places across the southeastern US, where fire is such a dominant feature. In systems like the red cockaded woodpecker and the brown-headed nuthatch, unusually large territories in a fire-prone system, and cooperative breeding results as a process by which they gain advantages in defending those territories. So I'm going to conclude now with this slide that I started with and just summarizing what we see as the key features of the simple systems on the left, the boom and bust acorn crops that selects for mobility. There's a lot of widely available habitats in the West such that first-year breeding is actually quite possible, even with some success. Early breeders sometimes do succeed in producing offspring. In contrast, over here on the right, particularly focusing on our Florida system, the annually available acorn crops are essential. Local habitat patches, limited breeding opportunities, saturated breeding environments, a premium on large territories, selecting for delayed dispersal and investment in the group as a way of defending those territories. I want to just close by contrasting the Florida scrub jay system with what we see as the story in the Mexican jay. In the Florida scrub jay, I mentioned territorial budding. It's about 20 to 25% of the males become breeders through budding. The process is gathering a female disperser and beginning to live on one corner of the natal habitat. During that period, the females begin to compete with one another, and ultimately they are the ones that enforce a boundary between these two territories. So new territories develop as a result of budding. And subsequently, should they stay alive, and remember it's risky, but should they stay alive, the budded pair works over the next several years to expand the size of that territory. The key difference between the Florida scrub jay system and the Mexican jay system, we think, simply involves the fact that there's so much premium in an essential habitat, which is in the case of the Mexican jay, these riparian river bottoms. There's so much premium in group size for defense of essential habitat that this behavior of defending a boundary between immigrant females and the resident females has disappeared. The consequence is that this looks to us humans like a functional, big, solid group. As we look in detail the social behavior of Mexican jays, we actually know that it consists of separate pairs within this group and some cross-feeding of one another, but indeed it's really an assemblage of separate pairs within those systems that have simply lost. There's no selective advantage. In fact, there's a selective disadvantage in maintaining smaller territories and smaller group sizes. There's actually advantages within that particular habitat system for larger groups. That takes me to the end of my talk and to the 11:55 moment. So I'm happy to end there and take questions. I will stop sharing at this point.
Thank you very much, Fitz. Fantastic presentation. I really appreciate it. I mean, it's a wonderful data, clear, so many questions. I will just repeat. I mean, we know that, of course, many of you join us every week, so this may be repetitive to you, but for always welcoming our new members. The way we do it now, we move, some of you are already moving fast and typing the question mark in the chatting window. That's what you want to do. If you want to ask a question, please type the question the question mark in the chatting window to everyone so that you know where you're falling on the list. And I'll be calling each of you in order. We definitely, I want to say it one more time, we want to hear from our younger colleagues, younger scholars. That includes students. So we have had some students who have asked wonderful questions. We need more of that. Please don't be shy. If I need to skip some of our senior colleagues, you can count me. I will give you priority. We want to hear from our young colleagues. But now let's get started. By the way, today we will finish 12:45, the question and answer session, because Fitz needs to go to another important meeting. Our first question today comes from Nathan Blundell. If you can briefly state where you are, and then please go ahead, Nathan.
Okay. Hello everyone. I'm a French student from Sorbonne, Paris North University. And I have...
Can you, Nathan,
yes.
I suggest, do you want to try shutting down your video? At least for me, you're not coming through clearly. Maybe.
Yes, either that, or maybe you could even chat a question and I can look at it in the chat. Is that possible?
That's
We're having trouble with the hearing.
Right.
Okay.
I suggest you either shut down the video, see if the signal improves, or type your question. While you do that, don't worry. I'll take the second question. You're going to come right after that. So while you write your question, Nathan, because you're not coming clearly, let's listen from Michael Taborski next. Then we go back to you, Nathan, if you want to write it down. Thank you, Nathan. Michael?
I'm Michael Taborski, University of Bern. Thank you very much for this really intriguing talk and fantastic data set that you have over 50 years. It's really amazing. I was particularly intrigued by your comment that you regard the direct fitness benefits as much more important than the indirect fitness benefits, especially because, of course, Florida's sculpture were one of the major model systems that were well known for the importance of kin selection in the early times. So I would like to know whether you have done any kind of quantitative comparison of the influence of direct and indirect fitness components in the evolution of this cooperative breeding system.
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. We did some time back when we were when we were paying particular attention to this. I think it was maybe in the book with on lifetime reproductive success back in the 1990s. So the answer is no. Recently, we haven't. It's a good thing for us to do now, armed with a much larger data set that shows much more convincingly that there is a very small but measurable indirect gain. I'm going to just give you an intuitive answer now, but it would be, I think, quite easy to do the modeling. One remembers that there's a 20% chance annually of mom and or dad dying every year. And so many of those gains, sort of individual incremental gains by additional helpers, are actually going to be cut by half each time a parent dies. So within the first 2 or 3 years of life, the total amount of offspring equivalent that most of these jays can count on average is well under half a bird, half an offspring. It's more like 0.2 offspring. And if you compare that with the alternative of getting out there, there's about a 60% chance that a bird that lives to age 1 will ultimately become a breeder. Now, you saw that's no guarantee of leaving offspring either. But ultimately there are opportunities for leaving a lot. So intuitively, I would say right now, that total amount of indirect fitness gain on average is pretty tiny compared to what one has good possibilities of accomplishing as a breeding bird. it's time for us to model that again now that we have these data. We have not done that. But by the way, the data are in the book, so in that book chapter. So, and we'd be delighted to send the numbers. So if somebody wants to do that game, that'd be a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think this would be really worth trying to.
I agree, Michael. Let's do it.
Okay, thanks.
So thank you, Nathan. Nathan was trying to ask a question, but the communication was not good enough. So I'm going to read. He's now been kind enough to write down. He's a French student of the Sorbonne Paris Nord University. And he's asking Fitz that in one of your slides, it's about the 15th slide, he asks, why didn't you do a McWhitney-U test when there were 150 static units in the groups? Why not do a non-parametric test based on the original data like a Fisher-Pittman?
Great question. I think we probably did a bunch of them and we just picked that one to show. So that would have been typical for that period of time when we were doing those tests. So I think the results ultimately are comparable regardless of what test we use. But that's again very, very much something that we can go back and shore up at this point with even more data. So.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Fitz.
Thank you, Nathan.
The next question is from Maren Hoek.
Hello, my name is Maren Hoek. I'm from the University of Derby, and together with Eduardo, I'm very interested in floaters. So my question is, and we may define floaters a little bit different than some bird people. So for us, floaters are everybody who is dispersing for a longer period of time. So do you have data on the dispersing individuals and what they are up to while they are dispersing and how long that lasts and how aggressively they try to enter breeding territories?
Well, that's a really, really good and important question. And I'm happy to say I showed her picture. Our student Young is working on right now, actually on a paper that is related to your question. Technically, we don't have floaters, at least as we tend to define them in birds. This, in contrast to the Western scrub jay and the island scrub jay, in the Florida scrub jay, we don't see individuals living on their own in the interstices of territories. They are constantly trying to establish themselves as a member of a group, even if they have to be subordinate. You know, the extreme examples are an orphaned offspring, which is now suddenly lost a territory because everybody else immediately collapses in. That orphaned offspring will live with a group nearby as a subordinate helper. So we don't see individuals that are not affiliated with a group basically at all. Now, what Young is looking at right now and has done a really good job of sifting through our long-term data to show is that something close to 25%, something between 20 and 25% of helpers eventually establish themselves as a helper, as a subordinate helper in a different territory prior to either breeding or dying. There's something analogous here to your question in these birds that have moved from home and have established themselves in a different group than their own, a non-kin group, but living with that group as subordinate birds. And the question is, why do they do that? And I can give you a quick preliminary look at what the answer appears to be, which is there's little disadvantage in terms of survival and ultimate reproductive success. But the ones that are doing it tend to be leaving early, going longer distances from home, from territories that have a larger number of same-sex helpers. So it has the hallmarks of a situation in which individual jays make the assessment that they are subordinate within their group and perhaps subordinate within the neighborhood, And so they're actually leaving the safety of the natal territory and heading off into join some other groups elsewhere in which they have a more chance of gaining the breeding space. I don't know. That was a bit of a rambling answer. Did that answer anything like your question?
Yes, and it's very interesting, obviously, the different approaches.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. I want to take the liberty of changing plans a little bit. So we're going to mix. I'm going to mix and match some of our regular people asking questions. I want to be sure we get to our younger colleagues. So Sarah, I will go back to you guys. I know who is coming next, but let's take some of the students mixed with some of the more senior colleagues as we get the question. So Sarah Westrick, if you can please go ahead with your question, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a postdoc at University of Illinois. Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting to watch. So my question was about the budding territories. I'm curious if you see any patterns in the breeding pairs that kind of allow that budding or allow part of their territory to be taken up.
Again, you've kind of put your finger on one of the sort of standing mysteries that we have in here. The quick answer is no, we can't find, and again, this is something that Young is looking for too in our data, but we can't find specific predictors for which pairs or which, helper males do it. What we do know behaviorally is that male breeders help their sons do it. When we watch it happen, we're seeing this is not just the son himself doing the extra defense at the boundary and doing the pairing. His male parent is often over there helping do the defense. In fact, we've sometimes see actually pretty big movements of a territory boundary during this budding process. So when we see it happening, it often looks like a cooperative process that at least the male breeder is helping with. But honestly, we can't find any really obvious correlations that tell us which ones of these birds are going to do it or which ones of these pairs are going to let it happen. It's kind of a mystery still. The one thing that we feel we have answered is the question, why doesn't it happen more often? Because it's obviously, when we look back through at the survivorship of jays that became breeders by budding, intuitively we would have thought that would be a big positive, but it's clearly the opposite. It's a dangerous, risky thing to do, and it's only, again, we have no independent measure of quality. If one of you can invent some independent measure of quality, let me know and let's become famous together about that. Right? So, but it sort of has the hallmarks of being a quality dependent thing that only a few jays do.
Thank you.
Kaya Tombak, you're next.
Hi, I'm Kaya. I'm a postdoc at Hunter College. Thank you so much for that talk. So you showed us that not only do the Florida scrub jays hold very large territories for their body size, but they also happen to be the smallest scrub jays in general. And so I just wondered if in your system, not only does it help to have a large territory, but might it also help to be small if you have longevity being such, longevity in a highly unpredictable environment being such a key factor for fitness. And also this cooperative defense of the territory where maybe body size isn't so important.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. One feature to underscore about the peninsula of Florida is that it's really hot, especially during the summer from April to November. Yes, there are convective thunderstorms, but the humidity is pretty high and the heat is pretty intense. So I have always sort of thought, well, the small body size has some advantages in a system that is as sort of heat stressed as this one. But the idea that there may be some adaptive advantage relating to cooperation, it's worth thinking about. I'm not sure I can picture it quickly, but it's possible. Maybe you've got a line of thought that helps me think about that in a better way.
I was thinking more in terms of minimizing energy needs per individual, and then not needing large sizes, or per individual. And
not needing large sizes because there are additional individuals often in your territory to do the job, right? So to speak. Yeah, that could be. It is a system that, it's in Florida. We get 55 inches of rain a year. It's very seasonal, more or less predictably seasonal, with acorns and arthropods. But the resources are pretty thinly distributed. And so there may actually even be just some energetic advantages of being small in a system in which they have to work pretty hard to find bugs. We've actually we did 12 years of very intensive insect sampling. Our best way to sample the insects and to ask questions about this energetic question what we discovered was to forage like a scrub jay and just do quantitative foraging bouts of 1 hour long and measure everything that we're doing. Because watching scrub jays enough teaches us what they're looking for and where they're looking for it. And we could show pretty clearly that by about September and October, the resource is getting really thin. And during the cooler months of November, December, January, it's hard to find a bug. And so that's why they're going to acorns at that point. And living on acorns can't be all that great either. So.
Thank you. The next question is from David Wood.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a second-year graduate student at Yale, working with Eduardo. And I am curious about the male dispersal decisions. I think you said that some males disperse relatively close to home within 2 territories. And I'm wondering if for the males who disperse even closer, if there's some attenuation of the territoriality when the parents and the offspring share a border, and if that could lead to these nearby dispersal decisions, or if you think it really is just ecological familiarity.
Great question. There's no question in our minds. Again, I just make this anecdotally, but one could measure this in situations that exist, that the relationship between father and son in adjacent territories, whether those are a result of dispersal to pair with a widow or budding, relationships between father and son are pretty light. We know this from years and years and years of territory mapping, which is when we get a father-son boundary, it's a lot harder to get that boundary determined. We have to try to attract the females so that we can get the females to do the job. So the answer is yes, particularly between the 2 males. And does that itself sort of select for nearby? It very well might. There's a certain amount of neighboring nepotism involved in that. One thing we can say is that the females don't show the same behavior. The females don't like each other. So that often, through a course of a year or 2, that sort of begins to develop pretty standard territorial boundary defense, even among parents and their offspring. But early on, especially that first year, there's definitely a leniency and even some movement permission between the father and son across their territory boundaries.
Wow, very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. Our next question is from Sari Van Bell.
Hi, Sari from the University of Texas in Austin, and you have already answered my question about the floaters. So thank you very much.
So
hello to Austin.
I'm actually in Mexico, so but hello, no matter what.
Okay, so let's go now to Karsten Schrading.
Yes, hello, I'm Carsten Schradin from Strasbourg in France, doing fieldwork in South Africa. Thanks for this amazing talk, which again in this series shows how important long-term studies over even decades are important to really understand what is driving a system. And there was a lot of information, and I'm not sure if I processed everything right, so maybe you already said everything I'm asking. So the point is they need these acorns as an emergency food in winter. But after the fires, there's for 2 years nearly no acorns. That leads to quite increased mortality in breeders. Does it also lead to increased mortality in adult helpers, or is it just the breeders? And what is the reason for the increased survivorship of yearlings? Is it because there's the more protein-rich young plant material and insects in the burned forest? What is the reason that the yearlings survive better?
Yeah. So let's see. The first question had to do with the elevated mortality among breeders.
Is it only breeders?
I freely admit that I went through that slide pretty quickly. That slide was for breeding adults, and it was particularly focused on those breeders whose territories had more than 80% of the territory burned. So it was like, if your territory gets basically scorched, you're in trouble, because when fall comes, summertime, they forage in amongst the ashes and everything else, they're fine. But when fall comes and acorn harvesting is upon you, if you don't have any ripe acorns there because it's been burned, you're toast. So they start to have to actively try to defend and find some new territory that's not burned. And that has a consequence of elevated mortality. There's just a lot of stuff going on. Happens to coincide with when the hawk migration is coming through. So accipiters are coming through. So it's very costly in every respect. And that applies specifically to the breeders in totally burned out territories. Your question was, is that also true for the helpers? And the answer is that is one of the things that results often in helpers leaving. So they ditch the spot. So that's that. Then you were asking about why is important, super important question. What is it about the early post-fire successional stage that supplies this big benefit in juvenile survival? And the answer is, we are almost certain the greatly reduced predator pressure on those offspring. Those offspring, beginning, 1 month out of the nest, they're pretty independent, but they're stupid. And, it takes them a year to become a relatively competent, smart jay. By smart, you all know what I mean, right? They can do things that look more like what they're supposed to do as adults. But during that first 6 months, they're still learning. And in most habitats, the standard proportion of jays moving from fledging to 1 year is 35%, 30 to 35%. So elevating that to 50%, that's a big life table contribution. And that is all about fewer snakes, fewer raccoons, fewer foxes, more predators, all more visible to the adults who are on sentinel. So everything about that life stage in the early post-fire gives offspring a bit of an advantage in staying alive.
Thank you.
Next question from Mariela Oviedo Diego. Mariela, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mariela from Argentina, of the University of Cordoba. Thanks, Sean, for the talk. And I want to know if the fire can affect the degree of extra paternity or extra pair paternity or the sexual system in any way in the generations following the fire.
Really good question, and we've asked that every way we can. We've asked the question of all three of the populations that we've been studying since the from 1990 to the present. We've been studying these other two ones besides Archbold. Very recently, armed with a very detailed bead chip analysis of 27,000 SNPs, our conclusion is there is no extra pair paternity in the Florida scrub jay. Fire doesn't make a difference. Demographic situations like the suburbs, which are always messed up by higher mortality, yes. No difference. Fragmented habitats, as we study up in the bombing range nearby, no difference. They just don't do it. And from our standpoint, this was published in a paper a few years ago. First author was Andrea Townsend. And our thesis is that the Florida scrub jay anchors the no extra pair paternity end of the spectrum. And the question is why? Because most songbirds actually, as you know, since you asked the question, most songbirds have it 10 to 40% of the offspring are EPP. Mm-hmm. Very quickly, you want to know my answer?
Yes, yes.
Very quickly, try this one out because all we can do is arm wave on it. But it's this system is it's an extremely difficult challenge to become an owner of a territory as a breeding adult. If you do the math, you know all these stages of life cut away at the probability that you're going to actually become a territory owner. Mm-hmm. For a female, and I'm of the mind that the decision about EPP is a female decision. As a female, if you're pairing with a jay that owns a territory, you already know that you're pairing with a jay that has survived and accomplished the most difficult thing there is to do out there in the population, namely own and defend a territory. The idea that pairing with some neighbor, especially a non-breeder, is going to give you as much reward as staying with the individual that you're paired with and remaining faithful. Remember that the longer the pair stays together, the better the reproductive success every year. So in my way of thinking, number one, there's little advantage in pairing with an adjacent male about whom you know less. And there are advantages to staying closely associated with and even investing in the safety and longevity of your mate. All of that says there's nothing gained by EPP in this system.
Okay, super.
That's pure arm waving, right? But it's
yes, it's amazing. Thank you.
I think that David, I think it's you next, right? David Fisher. I'm scrolling. Yes, David Fisher, please. Your turn. You've been patient.
Hi, my name is David. I'm a research fellow at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. So I think that most of what we're talking about is the costs and benefits for the helper, for whether they should leave or whether they should stay. But do you think the breeding pair is under selection to try and keep helpers or ask them to leave? And if they are under selection in either way, you think they've evolved in any way to coerce these helpers to kind of do their bidding, as it were, even if it's only in small degrees?
I understand the question. In our book and in several papers through the years, we've taken to the phrase, in certain systems, the interests of the parents and the interests of the offspring are close to identical. And I think this is one of these systems where the parents clearly gain by having additional birds helping to defend and increase the size of the territory. This is, by the way, we think why parents are willing to accept subordinate helpers, that is, these dispersers from a different family that come in and join the group. They're subordinate, they're chased around, they're definitely, parents dominate these individuals, but they permit them to stay in the group. So there's a clear interest in the parents, on the part of the parents, to have the offspring stick around to help defend. By the way, defense is not the only thing they do. And by the way, feeding the young at the nest, we think is a secondary or tertiary advantage compared to territorial defense and sentinel behavior. And so if you think about this from the standpoint of either side, the offspring, which have, after all, the safest possible place to live, which is one that they grew up on. One that, by the way, remember, every fall they bury 8,000 acorns in. So there's a lot of reason to stick around, because all winter long you're going to be eating the acorns you buried. And in the process of doing that, helping defend the territory. So we can't devise a way in which we see the interests of the parents and the offspring diverging. Everything argues for these being, they're all being, the interests are convergent. Obviously, the parents' long-term interest is for those individuals to become breeders, right? And if becoming a breeder, if the best thing to do to become a breeder is to stay home, then you want them to stay home for that reason too, right? So I can't, and coercion has never, I've never been very satisfied with the idea that a territorial pair can coerce any bird to help. Helping is an internal decision on the part of the helper, not an externally imposed one.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We're going to take a question from our colleagues watching us through YouTube. Joshua Weber from University of Pretoria in South Africa is asking, why not use non-invasive methods to get DNA in order to reduce stress on young birds and immigrants?
Why not use which methods?
Non-invasive methods to get DNA samples, as opposed, I imagine, to bleeding them. Well,
I mean, any method that we pick is invasive to some degree. Whether we are getting, we can get feces from some, but there's also a certain amount of variability in the quality of samples when we get things from either saliva or feces or toe scrapes and things like that. And so that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is we've gotten very good at with a pinprick extracting 2 to 3 drops of blood and having that wound heal with no evidence of long-term injury. So we've asked the question, we've looked at it in terms of survival, in terms of behavior, so on. But the brachial vein, especially in 11-day-old nestlings, the brachial vein is very obvious, and it's very, it's easy to get a very small drop of blood from that. And with a little dab of pressure with cotton, that the bleeding stops. It's as uninvasive as we can imagine a way of getting a very well-controlled sample, namely, whatever number of microliters of blood we want. It's a very small sample that we take. So.
The next question is from Gabriela Gall.
Does it work? Hi, my name is Gabriela. I'm going to be at the University of Constance soon. I'm not yet there, so I'm currently in between jobs. My question, you kind of already answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyways. So I was wondering, when you have these budding territories where you said the male is really lax with the son, whether that might be a way also for that male to kind of, the father, to actually get extra paternity matings, because in that situation, if he helps his son to get a mate, that would be actually, I think, from what you explained, a situation where it kind of might make sense. Potentially, I don't know. It might be really a stupid question.
Well, no, it's not a stupid question at all, because it's a quite a logical question. And you know, if we were devising a system whereby you want to try to invent a way to maximize the chance of getting an extra pair paternity, that might be it. But they don't do it. So that's this is the beauty of the empirical science part of our work. We can model it about why it might make sense, but we actually, what we do is instead is measure whether they're doing it, and they aren't. So from my perspective, at least, the answer to that is that the female that would otherwise allow it isn't allowing it. And the answer to the question then is, why is that? And again, it comes back to whether she's got all she needs in terms of evidence of fitness on the part of her mate from the behavior of the mate. So, yeah, I mean, I sure get the question, and we sort of wondered the same thing, right? And we even thought, by the way, I won a pretty good bottle of wine from Herbie Levette when we did the big analysis of 4,000 huge analysis of jays in all these different demographic situations. And Herbie said, well, now that you're doing this one, he put a big bottle. The bet was, by the way, I said, I'll bet you a bottle of red wine, winner's choice, that we get fewer than 5% EPPs. And he took the bet, and it wasn't even just 5%. It was like 0.000. We had a couple of examples, but even those we could explain as being field errors on our part. We didn't realize that the mate shift had already taken place. So it looked like an EPP, but in fact, it was a mate change. So they just don't do it. That's simple as that. And so again, all we can do is wave our arms in terms of why that's true, but we can clearly say empirically that it's true.
May I ask another unrelated question? So I was also wondering, because my main topic is group coordination, how the jays actually move through their habitat. Is it always as a group kind of moving, or are they also kind of dispersing slightly away from the groups while foraging?
Yep. Yeah, good question. And I would say 90% of the day they are within a few meters of each other. So they're staying together pretty much all the time. The big exception to that is happening right now. It's March right now. The pairs are beginning to build and lay eggs. And this is also the point at which the yearlings, the almost 1-year-olds, last year's fledglings, they are starting to do some wandering. So they move around and do these prospecting visits to neighboring territories. And then they come back home. This is like an hour here, a couple hours over there, but they're back home every night. And incidentally, when they do that, pertinent to your question about group coordination, when they're doing these prospectings, they're rarely alone. So they're doing it with a small group of other, juvenile, 1-year-olds or nearly 1-year-olds together. So they're staying, we put it in the vernacular, Florida scrub jays just do not like to be alone. They really avoid being by themselves. Because it's dangerous. It's the things pick them off. And they have a very, very well-developed sentinel system, a very stereotyped sentinel system, and a very, very clear set of alarm calls that are identifiable as to what the threat is. There's an aerial predator alarm. There's a mammalian predator alarm. There's snake alarms. So they're really paying attention to the need to stay alive. And as a consequence, we think that that's a big part of why they just don't want to mess around by themselves.
Super interesting. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
We go next to Carolina Pacheco.
Hi, my name is Carolina, and I'm a graduate student from the University of Porto, Portugal. and amazing presentation, really. And I wanted to ask you a bit of a follow-up from Sarah's question about the budding territory. So is there any differences between the territories that allow for the budding and the others in terms of ecological availability of food or less predators or some ecological difference that could explain that?
Well, they do tend, sorry. They do
it's
tend,
another question. Maybe I can ask later.
I mean, the territories in which budding occurs do tend to be larger. They're on average, they tend to be in the larger category, which makes some sense, right? In the smallest territories, there is clearly a minimum territory size, and we actually see that when we occasionally see novice breeders do a little bud or even a de novo territory in between others, and they try to defend, they'll abandon eggs if they can't get at least 7 to 10 acres that's clearly their own. They'll just abandon the nest and go back to their respective territories. So there is a minimum territory size. It's about 7 acres, but a 7-acre territory is pretty small out here. And so conversely, back to your question, when budding happens, it does tend to be from the set of territories that's large. This sort of standing mystery is that there's a lot of large territories with older male helpers, but they didn't bud. So that by itself clearly doesn't explain the whole deal.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. My other question was about so they tend to disperse small distance and stay closer to their natal territory. Yes. Do you see any evidence for inbreeding that might happen from close relatives that disperse to the same territory?
Yes, and we've actually got some papers on that that have been published by a couple of students that have been looking very carefully at questions about the genetics of the neighborhood. There's one in particular, I could, Eduardo, do you have a mechanism for me sending the group a paper?
Probably the easiest would be the chatting window, but if you email me, if you email me the paper, I'll just send it to everyone.
I'll just say it out loud, and if you're interested in it, you can go Google it up and find it. It's by Stephanie Aguilon, Aguillon, et al. Several other authors. Nancy Chen is a part of that, and they looked at the very detailed. It's in PNAS. And actually PNAS had a really nice essay about the paper too, because it's a really beautiful, because we know so much about the pedigree and the local, history of the individuals. This is a really nice demonstration of the progressive genetic distances away from a given source and what the genetics of a neighborhood looks like. And indeed, we do have cousin, second cousin, grandparent, grand offspring, things like that do happen accidentally, just as a consequence of this viscous dispersal situation. So it actually does raise the question, which we haven't really addressed much yet, but it raises the question whether there's some inbreeding advantage that could exist in these local places like this. So we don't suspect that, but we can't rule it out. So
you don't see any evidence of physiological disadvantage or morphological?
No, there is actually. I should say that there are we do have a couple of signals of inbreeding depression, of the cost of inbreeding, I should say. Yeah. Hatching, and this was part of Nancy Chen's PhD dissertation, that the hatching rates go down with elevated levels of inbreeding, slightly, but significantly. So a slightly higher chance of eggs failing to hatch. And there is some survival cost in terms of inbred offspring. So,
thank you so much. It's very interesting.
I apologize if you talked about this, but the first 10-15 minutes I was going crazy trying to moderate and get things organized, so I may have missed things you said. But did you comment on what form the aggression when they are defending their territories? How behaviorally are they aggressive? Are there costs inflicted in terms of wounds? Are the animals killing each other? We see a lot of aggression in the owl monkeys to the point that animals are killing each other over this.
Wow.
And who participates in the defense of the territory and how?
I can't believe that's true of those wonderful moose mookies.
They kill each other.
In the case of Florida scrub jays, the defense is very, very rarely physical attack. It's almost, I can't say it doesn't exist because it does. And, you know, in the process of our annual territory mapping, which, you know, as I said, I've done for decades now, the way we do that is we purposely bring families together and get them to start acknowledging each other, and then they go on their territorial displays. The standard territorial displays are very conspicuous flights, very conspicuous stereotype calls. The female Florida scrub jay has an extremely distinctive female specific call, which we refer to as the hiccup. That's most corvids, the females have a rattle, and the hiccup in the Florida scrub jay is very distinctive, very conspicuous. It's a whole separate posture and everything. So there's a lot of display. In fact, almost every vocalization that Florida scrub jays give have one thing or another to do with aggression. But it's all behavioral. It's all display modulated, mediated, as opposed to physical attack. We can, as about, you know, throw some peanuts down and get two males together. They can sometimes chase each other physically and do occasional pecks. And an occasional dominance between an adult and a juvenile of a different territory can result in a physical attack. But again, it's pretty much all without touching each other. Another one, I'll just mention one other thing since you were asking about the sort of physical form of territorial behavior. Once these birds don't fly very well. They forage mainly on the ground or near the ground. Their wings are pretty short comparatively. They're not real aerial birds. They're not like blue jays, which are aerially very competent. These scrub jays are aerially very weak. But the one time we see them fly is when they're chasing another individual out of the territory. So they'll do long, very long, protracted chases, aerial chases up and down until they finally wheel back and, you know, get back into their home territory.
Thank you. We have now a question from, I hope you pronounce your name well, Shaylee Shah.
Shaylee, how are you?
Oh,
good. How are you?
Great.
I'm Shaylee.
Where are you right now?
I'm in Ithaca.
Oh, good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's finally sunny out here. So I'm from Columbia University, but I'm currently in Ithaca, New York. And I have a quick question, which, you know, seems like from what you said about the lack of EPP in these birds and the importance of the pairs staying together for as long as they can, what do you know about mate choice in this species, and how does that work? It seems like mate choice would be really important.
Yeah, if you can solve that question down here, you get the big gold star. I would dearly love to have somebody figure out how we can crack that question. We do know that that courtship can be fairly fast, especially right now, March. The breeding season is beginning, and so everything is sped up and a little bit more intense. So jays that seem like they're totally unrelated to one another and not interested in one another 3 weeks ago, we can see them doing displays. So the courtship basically consists of territorial display rituals. And we can watch this happen for several days in a row, and we start to see a possible new pair. 3 days later, they're back home and doing nothing. They're ignoring each other again. So we also have one other feature that I'll gamble here and tell you about, which we wrote about a few years ago, which was the fact that some males, this is particularly true of males, the ones that you saw that the age of first breeding curve, there's some males 3, 4, 5 years old are still not breeding. Some of those males are ones that we're regularly seeing trying to pair at various places with a female, but the female not selecting them, and they seemed inept, sort of. And so we deemed that we termed them wandering inept male pre-breeders, or WIMPs. There is clearly some difference in quality out there that we assume that females can see easily and therefore fail to choose these individuals. But which ones they actually do choose and why, that's one question that Young is trying to figure out with her movement information. We still really haven't cracked that nut. It's a tough one. I think it has a lot to do with this standing real problem in animal behavior, which is how do we find a genuinely independent measure of quality? It's just, all we can do is sort of correlate it post hoc with some things, and it's really hard to do. So, but I love it. If you want to do a postdoc, come down and figure out the answer.
Well, thank you very much to everyone. It's already 12:45, and I think that Fitz has really been very, very kind with his time, and we've had lots of questions today. I want to thank you, everyone. I want to thank Fitz for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, all of you, for contributing to making this a lot of fun, a very interactive event. We look forward to seeing you next week. Next week, we're going to have Doug Emlen from the University of Montana in the USA, who's going to be presenting to us a talk that he's titled Extreme Weapons, a Natural History. So we look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday. Have a wonderful day and see you then. And thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. I appreciate your attention and wonderful questions.
Discuss. On this one, discuss. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Okay.